Hello, this is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association, and it gives me a lot of pleasure and intellectual stimulation to talk to Ambassador John Bolton in our latest podcast. Uh, we are living, as Confucius allegedly once said, interesting times, especially on the foreign policy front, Ambassador. And the it seems that this administration, you're never quite sure whether it's creative ambiguity or the fact that they don't have a clue what they're doing. I'll leave it to you to comment on that. But there are several big key issues which members have raised with us. One is, of course, is there an end game in Venezuela? Not to mention the rest of Latin America, which seems to be unhappy about the way things are going. There's the issue of Taiwan and whether the creative ambiguity is going too far there. And also a recent one is Western Sahara, which you were involved in. And uh, it seems that the US has sold the past completely, ripping up all of the former solutions that involve self-determination in return for autonomy under the Moroccan crowd, which is a bit like Czechoslovakia having a protectorate under the Third Reich as far as practicality is concerned. So, what would you say? Let's begin with your comments about the current foreign policy of the administration. Is there one?
Well, I think it's hard. It's hard for most people to understand. It was certainly hard for me to understand that Trump doesn't have an operating philosophy. He doesn't do uh, grand strategy in national security. He doesn't really even follow policy lines as we commonly understand that. He's reactive, transactional, episodic, ad hoc. And I think that explains a lot of the confusion and turmoil in almost anything that gets involved in international affairs. I think the circumstances in Venezuela today are a good example of that. I mean, I am all in favor of overthrowing Maduro. I think we've got plenty of legitimate American national security interests at stake, not to mention the welfare of the people of Venezuela. We tried to do it in 2018 and 19 through economic pressure. We worked carefully with the opposition. We had strong bipartisan support in Congress. The Latin American countries, really on their own, had developed the Lima group that coordinated the anti-Maduro activities and had almost everybody in the hemisphere except for Cuba and Nicaragua really involved in it. I don't see any of that kind of activity this time. There's bickering in Congress. I'm not sure that we're really aligned with the opposition. And in the meantime, Trump is blowing these drug boats out of the water in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, accusing Maduro of being responsible for them. He's brought the Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group from Europe to the Mediterranean, which it means we've got more force in the Mediterranean than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We don't know what he's
The
going to do.
Caribbean, not
I
the
said,
Mediterranean.
pardon me?
The Caribbean, not the Mediterranean.
But no, I'm sorry, he brought it from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And I said the other day, this is, he's now put the gun on the table. Is he going to use it, or is he just going to have them sail back to the European theater? I mean, it's a little bit of the cart before the horse because we haven't had an explanation of what the objectives are. I mean, I don't expect Trump to put everything out in public. Obviously, you're going to keep that from the adversary, but you have to justify just for your own sake, if nothing else, why you're trying to accomplish the overthrow of Maduro. I think that's perfectly easy to do, although we haven't done it, and to show you've got support for it in Congress, internationally, which Trump has not done. So I'm worried. It's not that I object to the end result of overthrowing Maduro, but we tried once before and didn't make it. I don't want to try and fail again for our own sake, let alone for the sake of the people of Venezuela.
Well, one of the things that one of our correspondents raised was the lack of any sort of serious opposition within the Republican Party to these, the lack of philosophy, the how should I say, it's the sporadic and occasional nature of it. He wakes up one morning, increases tariffs. The next morning he wakes up and backpedals on them. So it's very difficult to have a coherent foreign policy. But where are the Republicans who are saying this is not the way to go?
Well, I wish there were more standing up, and I think there are a lot of Republicans who support the objective of overthrowing Maduro. So that's not particularly a problem. And as I say, in 2018 and 2019, there were a broad base of Democrats that felt the same way. There's a strong Venezuelan American community in the country, and together with the Cuban American community, they feel very strongly about these authoritarian regimes in the hemisphere. And we can and should feel very strongly about the Russian presence in Cuba, the Chinese presence in Cuba, I mean, in Venezuela, the Cuban presence in Venezuela, the Iranian interest in supporting Hezbollah's activities all throughout South America in particular, based out of Caracas, their interest in Venezuela's very substantial uranium deposits, some say the largest in the world after Canada. So there's a lot of interference from countries outside the hemisphere and from other autocracies like Cuba in the hemisphere. And that gives us, this is not simply an idealistic pro-democracy initiative here, although you can bet the people of Venezuela would like a chance to pick their own government. They did in 2018 when Maduro stole that election. They tried again recently in 2024. Maduro stole that election. The people of Venezuela have a key interest in this, and of course they say they support an effort to remove Maduro, but there's no indication, no feeling, no sense that they and the Trump administration are working carefully together, and that's important because if the U.S. does use military force and Maduro does fall, which I would hope would be the outcome, then the opposition has to take the reins of government. They've got to be ready for it. They can't just wake up one morning and say, "Oh, I guess we'll now run the government." And if we fail, they will bear the brunt of the pain, which Maduro will surely try to inflict on them and anybody else he can get his hands on. So there's a lot at stake here, and the risks and the dangers are high, which is why this is not rocket science. You need a plan. You need to have thought through what you're doing in order to overthrow Maduro. And if this contingency fails, what do you do next? No plan is perfect, especially in this kind of scenario. But the sense is Trump just sort of looks around and says, well, let's take out that gunboat or let's bring this carrier battle group from somewhere. It's not the way to do it.
Well, you mentioned the hemisphere. Where you talk, he seems to have no concept of how to build alliances apart from threatening them. So we move from bluster over Mexico, threatening troops, and then blunder by actually landing troops in a piece of Mexican territory. So he's compounded his blundering blustership on that, and similarly, he's alienating many of the other people who he really needs to rely on if he were to take action on Venezuela.
Well, you know, the circumstances are internationally are quite different now. As I say, the Lima Group, which was not something the United States created, it was created by the Latin American countries that fully understood Maduro and the corruption represented by his regime, the support for the drug traffickers, the interference of the Russians, Chinese, and others was a threat to them too. And in 2018, 2019, we had President Duque in Colombia, who was very sympathetic to the Venezuelan opposition, and President Bolsonaro in Brazil, also sympathetic, two of the key bordering countries on Venezuela. Today, Trump is at swords point, in effect, with both Colombia, the governments of Colombia and Brazil. So it's not clear what cooperation we're going to get there. I think many of our friends around the world who, in the first effort, froze Maduro regime assets and tried to provide support for the opposition are simply not engaged in this at all. In fact, many of them are worried about what Trump is doing with respect to the drumboats. There are reports in the media that the government of the United Kingdom has pulled back from sharing intelligence with the United States under the Five Eyes Agreement because they're worried about what uses will be made of it when they see what's happening with the attacks on the drug boats.
Well,
So,
the point there is these are alleged drug boats because if you blow them up, you've destroyed the evidence one way or the other.
well, I mean, there's a whole subject to be had on whether doing this is wise or not, whether or not it's legal. You know, as the Marquis de Talleyrand once said, "It's worse than a crime; it's a mistake."
Yeah.
And it certainly gave advance notice to Maduro that we might be prepared to use military force, and he'd be totally incompetent, which may be the case if he hadn't used the time that he's gotten to strengthen his defenses, to prepare for potential attacks, whether by special forces or by cruise missiles, whatever it might be. And it really raises the question: are we really prepared? Do we really understand what we're about to get into? And I'll just underline one more time: I don't have any trouble with overthrowing Maduro. I'd be delighted if Trump had a plan and succeeded. I'm afraid there's no plan, and that most likely, therefore, means failure, which means Maduro stays in power. The Venezuelan opposition could be repressed as a consequence, and the U.S. looks foolish around the world.
Well, I did touch earlier on the Western Sahara solution that he railroaded through the Security Council, which, even though watered down, basically rewards the Moroccans for giving the finger to the rest of the world for all this time. And you were involved in this with James Baker. I was wondering if you'd what your thoughts on that resolution was.
Well, I think that was an unforced error by the Trump administration. Look, I was involved from 1991 when we created the peacekeeping force, MINURSO, in the Western Sahara to have a referendum for the people to decide did they want to become part of Morocco or did they want to become independent. It's a very small electorate, maybe 80,000 people. This was not hard to do. The Moroccans agreed to it. And there was a security resolution in 1991 that set all this up. So now for basically 35 years, there has not been a referendum. And it's because Morocco was afraid it would get the wrong answer, that the people would vote for independence. So I'm not normally a Wilsonian Democrat on these things, but we consciously decided in the wake of the overthrow, in the wake of the expulsion of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, in the wake of all the changes that were occurring in the Middle East, this was a chance to resolve one of these last hangovers of the Cold War, the failure of the Spanish decolonization of the Western Sahara when the Franco regime fell when Franco died in 1975. All we had to do was hold one referendum. How hard could that be? And we couldn't do it. And so I just think we promised the people, the Sawaris, that they would get a chance to vote on the future and what they wanted after the end of Spanish colonial rule, and they're not going to get that chance. And I think it's a terrible mistake, and it's a black mark for the United Nations that can't even carry out a referendum with 80,000 people over 35 years. But it's a bad grade for the United States too, and not being able to follow through on what we said we would do.
And of course, it's the United States and France that has mostly determined what the UN can or can't do with the strength of the veto in Western Sahara.
Well, the French wanted to back Morocco. I mean, this is the former French colonialism showing here, helping and that's why in Spain there's so much support for the referendum. It's their former colony too. We didn't have any former colonies in Africa. We just said in this indeterminate situation where the imperial power collapsed and where there was anarchy, and the Moroccan military defeated the Mauritanians, Polisario, and the Algerians, they won most of the Western Sahara by military force. Okay, well that's that. Now we're going to have a referendum to actually ask the people who live there what they want. And the Moroccans said we've had second thoughts, and I just don't think there's any good news there.
Speaking of conquering by military force, it's an easy segue from there and misplaced deals. Do you have what are your comments on the proposed Munich-style settlement being forced on Zelensky?
Yeah. Well, I don't really have any details other than what's out in the public, but it sounds to me like a deal that would occasion a lot of vodka toast in the Kremlin because the main elements of it are very favorable to Russia. And again, I'm only reporting what I've seen, and I'm not vouching for its accuracy. This is the press we're talking about, but presumably some of them have seen the text of the agreement. Uh, Russia is awarded territory it has not yet conquered militarily. Two, there's a buffer zone created that intrudes further into Ukrainian sovereignty. Three, Ukraine agrees to reduce the size of its military. Four, Ukraine agrees to give up long range strike weapons that could hit targets deep inside Russia. Ukraine agrees not to join NATO. And oh, by the way, the West is allowed to give security guarantees, the text of which we haven't seen, and not clear that even Russia would agree to that. So, in effect, saying to Ukraine, lay down a significant part. Oh, and no foreign troops to be stationed in Ukraine. I don't want to leave that out. Lay down a lot of your military capability in exchange for a promise that after the Russians invade next time, you'll be able to ring up Washington and say, "Hey, how about those security guarantees before the Russian tanks get to Kyiv?" I mean, I would be stunned if the Ukrainian government accepted this, and why any self-respecting European NATO member would accept it, I don't get that either. I think this is a victory for the Russians and for Putin's obstinacy, and I hope it falls by the wayside. But the press is reporting that Trump is saying he wants this signed by Thanksgiving, which is next Thursday. So he's not giving Zelensky and the rest of Europe much time.
Well, it'll go the way of the Thanksgiving turkey at current rates, I presume. Well, but what is the rationale behind all of this? I mean, it seems to abdicate every international local principle, and what impels Trump to kowtow so much to Putin, who has not covered himself in glory in 2 years of what's supposed to be was supposed to have been a walkover.
Well, it's I think directly connected to Trump's desire to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And he doesn't care what kind of deal it is, but if he can say, "I brought this war to an end," like the other 8 wars he's brought to an end in his second term, some of which were wars the countries involved didn't even know they were fighting, but we'll pass over details like that. I mean, he really this has been an issue since the first term. He thinks he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. He resents that Barack Obama got one. Didn't think he deserved it. I didn't think Barack Obama deserved it either, frankly. But
Well, I
that
have to
doesn't
agree
mean
with both of you on that, but that's another story.
because Obama didn't deserve a prize Trump should get the prize even though he doesn't deserve it. That's Trump's logic. It's certainly not anybody else's. But I do think that's a considerable motivating factor. Trump has never understood this conflict. He's talked to people who've said, basically Ukrainians are Russian. They speak the same language. It's Russian. Why is anybody objecting? Well, the reason is the Ukrainians have decided they're not Russian, and they want to be an independent country. And it remains the position of every NATO member that Ukraine should be restored to its full sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that this agreement's not going to come anywhere close to that. And I think even more troubling is if you set up this kind of ceasefire with a buffer zone, and pullback, reduction of Ukrainian military force, and then negotiate somewhere, Geneva, Vienna, some capital like that, for a permanent solution, you are in effect creating a de facto Ukraine-Russia border along that ceasefire line that over years of protracted negotiation will harden into a real border. So it gives Russia everything that it's conquered in an act of unprovoked aggression after, for 80 years now, since World War II, we said unprovoked aggression is unacceptable, at least on the continent of Europe. And we've just ignored that.
Well, speaking of borders and peace settlements, the resolution on Gaza has a lot of people scratching their heads because, once again, they can't see the rationale behind it. That whether you agree with the general terms or take one side or the other, this does not seem to be thought out, except possibly as a property deal for resort purveyors.
Well, I think everything is a property deal to Trump. That's all he knows. You know, is this at the corner of 57th and Fifth Avenue, or is it merely on the corner of 56th and Fifth Avenue? And look, I think the Security Council adoption basically adopted the Trump 20-point peace plan. Is part of the campaign to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Now he's got the Security Council in back of his idea. The trouble is, while I think essentially everyone would say we're glad the last living Israeli hostages were released. Most of the remains of the deceased hostages are back, not all of them yet, so that part of the conflict is over. But in the current state of play in and around Gaza, there's simply no evidence that Hamas is prepared to take the next step, which is demilitarizing and disarming. And if Hamas is not disarmed, if it doesn't lose its character as a military force, if the tunnel system isn't fully exposed and destroyed or rendered safe, then every one of the other steps in the plan is becomes impossible to achieve because the plan is predicated on a peaceful Gaza, and that simply will not be what's actually happening if Hamas remains a military force. And we know that Iran has been making efforts to refinance both Hezbollah and Hamas. We don't know exactly how much new weaponry has come in, but there seem to be indications that Hezbollah and Hamas both are recruiting again, trying to rebuild the forces, especially in the case of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And we're frozen in a ceasefire with a new ceasefire line, the yellow line inside Gaza, with Hamas troops trapped in tunnels on the Israeli side. I mean, we don't know what the way forward is, but I would say that there's general consensus that if Hamas doesn't demilitarize, we're dead stop again.
Well, I mean, it is beyond Gaza because there are no Hamas forces worth mentioning in the West Bank, and yet there's continuing mayhem there, which is one of the reasons why the Saudis and others are unwilling to give any wholehearted support to these solutions. Because as if extremist Israeli ministers can rampage and settlers can rampage through the West Bank untrammeled, then what's the peace? What's their excuse? There's no Hamas there for them to seek out.
Well, I think there's concern about both the settler activity and potential Palestinian territory backed by the Iranians in the West Bank. And I think what's happening is you're seeing the unraveling of the two-state solution. Gaza is a very different circumstance from the West Bank. And I don't know how you can rebuild Gaza. Forget the Trump plan to make it the Riviera of the Eastern Mediterranean. I don't think you're even back to making it a habitable location again. And yet the effort simply looks to be we'll rebuild Gaza better than it was before October the 7th, 2023, when in fact, Arab officials have told me over the past couple of years they believe something roughly in the range of 10% of the Gazan population has already exited. So it's gone from roughly 2 million Gazans plus or minus, maybe down to about 1.8 million. Most of them have gone to Egypt, some have gone elsewhere, and these are the people who had the resources basically to buy their way out. I think that shows what a lot of Palestinians in Gaza now believe, that there is no future there. And for the humanitarian purpose of finding a place where they and their children can have productive lives in a non-conflict situation with some hope of a future, it may be that is the way the Gulf Arab states will now begin to move in order to provide stability, because they fear the rise of or the return of terrorist groups that certainly don't have their best interest at heart on the peninsula.
So it's continuing to shed disorder across the region unless a solution is found. Looking at that, how do you consider the fairly obsequious greeting given to the Saudi Crown Prince this week. You know, as a journalist, we take somewhat exception to people who not only insult journalists by calling them piggy, but others who put them through meat grinders are welcomed and well, actually exonerated by the president of the USA.
Well, look, I think although Biden criticized the Saudis very heavily, he eventually accepted that things weren't going to change. And I think what Trump has done is he has shown by inviting MBS to the White House that that we're turning the page on the Khashoggi episode. And he really did that back in 2018. I mean, Trump was very clear back then. I don't think things have changed. I do think that the strategic interest of the United States mean that we have continue to have, as we have had since Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, when he met the king on an American battleship in the Red Sea, and they made the deal that led to the production of oil and the relationship we've had since then. It's important to keep the Gulf Arabs on America's side, and in a conflict that involves the growing China-Russia axis. This is a very important step, and I think Trump was being realistic and did the right thing basically. Now the question though is we've still got the problem of Iran. It has not gone away despite the damage that Israel and the U.S. did in going after the nuclear weapons program. That regime is still in place, and there will not be peace and stability in the Middle East, in my view, until that regime is replaced. And that I don't know if Trump and MBS talked about that. I certainly hope they did.
Well, if Venezuela is a tough nut to crack, then I'm presuming that Iran would be a far tougher nut altogether and
Well,
would
I
more
think the regime is
repercussions.
much weaker than people think. I think opposition is pretty intense, and I think the point at which the regime could fragment uh, would be the death of the Ayatollah Khamenei. He's 86 or thereabouts, plus or minus, not in good health. Their succession planning was pretty much destroyed. The new president is a placeholder. He's not eligible to be supreme leader. And there could well be a real fragmentation of that regime
But
because
do you see any signs that the likely successors in Iran will be any more pro-Western or sympathetic to Israel? My experience with talking to the Iranian opposition is one of the ways they compete with each other is to say we are more pro-Palestinian than them. It's a nationalist competition.
this point of view, the main thing would be to get the Iranian nuclear program put in mothballs and to stop the support for terrorism. And I think the regime is likely to fragment with enough outside pressure, but I don't think we're planning for that particular. I think we would have. I think the Israeli-U.S. attacks on the nuclear program did have a destabilizing impact, but not enough. And I think the reaction of the people in Iran was to say, if the regime couldn't protect the nuclear program, it shows how vulnerable it is. Doesn't mean it's going to fall tomorrow, but I think it's extremely unpopular. And I think since the killing of Masa Amini, the Kurdish woman who was murdered by the religious police 2 years ago, I think that that antipathy remains very strong. Now, the people of Iran are not out in the streets protesting, but at a time when there's no supreme leader and they're having to pick a new one, that could be a very, very difficult time for this regime.
While we're looking at trouble spots, there have been some interesting developments on Taiwan where the diplomatic ambiguity has been shifting, where the new Japanese prime minister is showing signs of, in a very nuanced way, indicating support for Taiwan without tweaking the tail of the dragon on the other side. Um, do you see any developments in the future on that?
Well, I think there could well be. I mean, I don't think we should ignore the interest Beijing has in retaking control of Taiwan. And I think what's been interesting, if you look at what the new Japanese Prime Minister Asane Takaichi actually said about Taiwan, it wasn't that remarkable. It wasn't some major new development. It was maybe a little bit more concrete about how Japan would see a Chinese attack on Taiwan, but nothing that should have been unexpected to anybody. It's been the case in Japan for a long time. They understand the attack by China on Taiwan is effectively an attack on Japan, and it's an attack on the first island chain and everything that that implies. What's been interesting is particularly the strength of the Chinese reaction to it. Say they're putting enormous pressure on Japan to step back or to modify what they said or to try and isolate Japan. And I think that that is an indication that China's desire to get Taiwan back has not been reduced. So I think the threat in certainly the East Asian theater remains very intense. I personally do not think this will be, we will see this in the form of a Chinese landing on Taiwan or a military effort to conquer the island. I think that's beyond China's capability, or at a minimum, it's far too risky. I mean, Taiwan's about 100 miles away over open sea. The Chinese don't have much of an amphibious capability, and maybe most important of all, they want Taiwan to fall into their lap like a piece of ripe fruit. They don't want to destroy the chip manufacturing facilities or indeed the enormous productive capacity that the Taiwanese have built up over the years. I think it's more likely that Beijing will create some kind of political crisis, some pretext, and put a blockade around Taiwan and see what we do about it. And if we don't break the blockade, then I think they do believe that Taiwan will fall to them very quickly.
And sort of finally, while we're hopping around the Pacific, North Korea, I think you were involved in that as well. I mean, there we have well, yet another non-signatory to the NPT, and he seems to be relatively quiet at the moment, but the situation is still fraught, obviously.
Well, I think they're just making continuing progress both on ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, and you know we've had reports that tied North Korea to Iran. We've had reports of Iranian nuclear scientists in Russia. The Russians have begun resumed, I should say, construction of units 2 and 3 of the Bushehr nuclear power facility. They built Bushehr 1 that came online in the early 2000s. I thought it was a mistake for us to allow that to happen because it's not these reactors are not simply for peaceful nuclear power. They obviously, in the course of their operation, generate plutonium, which is found in the spent fuel from the reactors. And if you reprocess the plutonium, which is a difficult operation, but if you extract the plutonium from the spent fuel, that's another way to get to fissile material for nuclear weapons. So the Russians are now adding 2 more reactors to Iran's arsenal, and there's every reason to be concerned that they're sharing more than just reactor technology. They're talking about nuclear weapons too. You have North Koreans fighting in Ukraine. So this is the first
No
time.
foreign troops in Ukraine, remember?
Yeah, I think the first time you'd have Asian troops fighting in Central Europe, maybe since Genghis Khan, and it just shows how related all of this is. And it's certainly on the mind of South Koreans who are seeing, you know, however many North Korean troops survive and actually come back to North Korea. They've had battlefield testing that South Korea hasn't had since 1953. So it's dangerous in the Indo-Pacific, and every reason to worry that we're not planning for contingencies that go well beyond trade disputes. We've got plenty of trade disputes with China, starting with the amount of intellectual property they've stolen from the U.S., Europe, Japan, and others. But the political military threats are very real as well.
Um, don't want to. I don't want to go anywhere near the your defenses against the lawfare against you. But could you? What do you think of how long can President Trump continue domestically
Look, yeah,
alienating
I
only
can't
people?
really talk about the specifics of my case, but the
Of course,
retribution obviously is going on. I'm not the only one, although he started against me back in the first term when he tried to stop
you're a pioneer.
publication of the book. There's a little First Amendment problem for you, but um, I think in on the political level, I think Trump may be past his peak. I think the elections earlier in November, the way the Epstein scandal has played out, the Senate's refusal to buckle on his demand to eliminate the filibuster, a lot of other things coming together that it's a demonstration that finally people are beginning to stand up to him. I certainly hope that's true.
Well, look, thank you very much, Ambassador. It's been a stimulated tour de l'horizon, and it's there are many more problems. If we had more time, we could address
Well, glad to
domestically
be
and
with you.
internationally. Thank you very much. This is Ian
Thank-
Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association, and we've been talking to Ambassador John Bolton, who is still at liberty, I'm pleased to say. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thanks again.